All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started here. I was talking to Chris. We don't have any major introductions, but I would like to say welcome to everyone. Thanks to Old Town for hosting us here. We got a full table, which is good to see. Seeing is going to be a new challenge for me. This is what 50 years of being on the earth has brought me, is reading glasses, so it's going to be a constant on and off battle to see hands and read at the same time. So I apologize for that in advance. Um, so we will get started. Let's see. Our first item on on the agenda today is the ever popular Mid Atlantic State of the Ecosystem Report. So we have with us in person Dr. Abby Tyrell. Thank you for being with us. And meeting is being recorded. And whenever you are ready, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I will get started. So today I'll be presenting an overview of our 2026 Mid-Atlantic State of the Ecosystem report. This is my first year as the lead editor for this report, so thank you very much for having me. So the state of the ecosystem has been coming in front of you for several years now. We follow the integrated ecosystem assessment framework to look at indicators linked to fisheries management objectives and follow open science principles. So we have ecosystem reporting at different levels of organization. In the State of the Ecosystem report, we focus on the system-wide entire ecosystem level. We're also developing other products called ecosystem and socioeconomic profiles that provide information at the stock level. So interpreting that ecosystem information in terms of what the impact might be on a single stock. But here today, talking about the ecosystem as a whole and not focusing in too much detail on any one particular species. So our report structure follows what we've been doing for the past couple years now. We've got our graphical summary, so I'll give an overview of the information and high-level takeaways from the report. Then I'll dive into performance relative to management objectives, so showing several indicators. First, just what they say, what the recent metrics are, and then going into some of the drivers and details behind why we think they are changing or why they look the way that they do. Then we talk about risks to meeting management objectives. That follows a similar framework of looking at some kind of performance observational data and then exploring potential drivers behind those patterns that we're seeing. And finally, we have a highlight section that looks at some recent events that perhaps aren't very well captured in some of our data streams, as well as incorporating observations from the fishing community. So this just outlines some of the indicators that I'll be going through today. Like I mentioned, we're going to be looking at performance metrics and then drivers of performance, risks to meeting management objectives, and drivers of those risks. So today I'm presenting on the Mid-Atlantic State of the Ecosystem report, where we assess indicators over the spatial scale of the Mid-Atlantic. You can see that highlighted in the map there in the light blue. We have some trend methods. So we assess a long-term trend for time series that are 30 years or more. Most of our indicators are presented as time series. We have some short-term trend methods that are used to assess the last 10 years only, or in the case where the full time series is shorter than 30 years, we assess that full time using the short-term method. So, diving into some of the high-level information contained in the SOE this year. On the left, there's the trend and status of fisheries management objectives, seafood production, and commercial profits all tend to be below the historic average, most of those also being associated with a long-term decline. And I will get into the details there and reasons why we think we're seeing these patterns. In terms of recreational opportunities, we see more kind of mixed and near average trends. This year, we have kind of reframed the stability section. So ecosystem and fishery stability is something we've presented on for several years. This year, we're looking at it through a bit of a different framework, which I will explain it in further detail. But we're thinking about stability in terms of change from baseline adaptive capacity and volatility within the system. And both in the case of the fishery and the ecosystem, we consider that those are showing signs that they're not stable. Our social and cultural indicators are, again, a bit of a mixed outcome because those are on the community level, and I'll get into some of those specific details in due time. We also are meeting our objectives for protected species bycatch and have some mixed trends in the protected species populations. So here's kind of the high level risks to meeting fisheries management objectives. So we're kind of continuing to see the patterns that have been highlighted in previous years. So there's risks to managing spatially. Species distributions are changing over time. We have risks to managing seasonally, where the timing of events, biological events, is changing over time. We consider risks to setting catch limits. So the productivity and fish condition have also shown some changes over time. And then finally, our fourth risk category is marine development. And so we present some information on the wind lease areas that are currently being developed. Also, new this year, we have some information on ocean forecasts. So the MAFMC ocean model is a relatively new product. And here we are introducing some of the potential ways that we can apply this forecast model for fisheries management. So on the left, those are seasonal bottom temperature predictions based on the model. It's predicting only whether the water will be warmer, near average, or cooler compared to historic averages, not exactly how much warmer or how much cooler, but just if it is warmer or if it is cooler. So you can see that winter, this is winter 2026, January to March 2026 was predicted to be cooler to near average depending on location, whereas by summer and fall 2026, it's getting into being warmer than average in more locations. And so that's one way we can get data from the model and present it on a scale that is hopefully useful for fisheries management. On the right, we are also showing the decadal bottom temperature forecasts. So unlike the seasonal forecasts, this is an annual average. It's not captured, but just what does the model predict the annual temperature will look like? And so what we can see there is the next 10 years or so have a return to near average conditions, compared to the full time series. And so that's another way that we can look a bit farther out into the future, but with a little less kind of spatial resolution. And so as I'm presenting all the other data this year, it would be great to get some feedback and discussion on how this ocean forecast information could be tweaked or presented in any different ways that facilitates its use as you make fisheries management decisions. So this year, our highlights are that it was a relatively cooler year compared to some of the earlier 2020s. There were cooler conditions in the Northeast specifically, despite quite a warm year on the global scale. Most surface and bottom temperatures were near or below the long-term average, although there were a few seasons where temperatures were a bit warmer in the mid-Atlantic. The cold pool was well established. It had above average persistence and extent. And as I go through the data, I'll highlight several places where we see these cool conditions kind of propagating through our different data streams. So this year we've we're building up our connections with fishing industry, fishing communities. So we also have started to incorporate more information that we get from those inputs. So we've got reports of record levels of white marlin, high abundance of billfish, sand lance, ilex, mackerel compared to recent years, and then some observations around shifting distributions and certain species being present or absent near the wind turbines. We also have this email address, so that is an email address we set up for public kind of communications. If anyone has comments, observations on what they're seeing on the water, we welcome you to send those to us. It gets forwarded to my inbox and several other people on the SOA team. So we do read all of those messages and use them as we're developing our report. So this is just a brief overview of our request tracking memo. This is a research process we go through with the SSCs from both regions each year. So this year we have kind of closed out or completed several of the research requests, and next slide has some of the high priority requests that are in most cases in progress that we're hoping to develop for future reports. So with that, I will get into the details. So first we're going to go through performance relative to management objectives. And here we have Mid-Atlantic seafood production. So what you can see is that total landings overall is down. However, when we look at the landings of council managed, in the figure on the left there, and by council managed, I mean specifically Mid-Atlantic council managed, not federally managed species. So the landings of council managed species does not show a trend despite a decline in overall landings. And when we look at recreational harvest, we have kind of a similar pattern with landings being lower recently compared to earlier in the time series. And that's also seen in landings of pelagic sharks as well. And so there's several, we explore several possible drivers behind why are we seeing this decrease. So the first one we look at is stock status. And we can see that we are mostly meeting objectives for the biomass and fishing targets of Mid-Atlantic managed stocks. So that does not seem to be necessarily a driver of lower landings. When we break out how much of each stock is caught compared to the quota, the catch ratio, you can see in the bottom left plot there, there's kind of a cluster of species that have catch ratios near 1, so almost all of the quota is being caught. So those could potentially be considered as being constrained by total allowable catch. However, the catch is set in response to the biomass of the stock. So it is possible that the amount of catch being supported by those stocks is just lower than desirable. We also see a couple species that have a lower catch ratio, so less than the full amount of quotas being caught, and that could potentially be a sign of other management constraints, such as spatial, temporal, or non-quota related regulations. Also thinking about drivers of landings, we look at the regional biomass. And what we see here is actually that the regional biomass does not have any decreasing trends. In fact, it has a couple increasing trends in certain guilds in certain seasons. And so what that shows us is that the productivity of the system as a whole does not seem to be decreasing. However, we do see declines in landings, particularly of planktivores, which is non-Mid-Atlantic managed species. And so next we look at commercial profits. We do see a short-term decline in the total profits. Again, not the Mid-Atlantic managed profits, but there is many state or New England managed species that contribute to that total revenue number. We also have a new indicator this year, or kind of a more established indicator, this profitability index, which looks at the revenue and costs from federal trips only. So that data is only available for trips reporting on the federal level, which is why it might look a tiny bit different than what's shown on the left. But from that, the revenue and cost information, we balance that into a profit index. So there we see a long-term decline in revenue, but the profitability does not yet show a decline. And we can see the overall profitability is really driven by revenue. Costs, although they are variable, don't really seem to be trending over time. So diving into why exactly we're seeing this pattern in revenue, we break down the profits into the portion that's due to the amount of stuff caught, and then the portion that's due to the price paid for those things that were caught. So that's the Bennett index that breaks the revenue into price and volume. And we can see in the last couple years, the price component as well as the volume component has been low. So the amount of landings has been low, the amount of price paid for those landings has been low. That has led to low revenue. And when we look at that on the guild level, we can see that is particularly due to benthos, so shellfish, being low in recent years. Moving on to recreational opportunities, here we look at recreational effort, which is actually near average, has been kind of fluctuating around near to above average in recent years. So that suggests that people are continuing to engage in the recreational fishery. They might just be harvesting fewer fish for various reasons. We do see a decline in recreational fleet diversity. That is representing a shift from party charter fishing to shore-based fishing, which potentially could imply that there is a change to the fishing opportunities and which species are being accessed by those recreational fishers if they are fishing from the shore as opposed to from a boat. And we do see an increase or a high value in the recreational diversity of the catch, a larger mix of species being caught recently. And so that's all kind of showing us some of the changes happening in the recreational fishery. Sorry, I don't think there we go. So next, looking at social and cultural indicators, we have a new indicator this year, or well, kind of a modification of our indicator, looking at commercial port activity. So that is based on dealers, landings, and permits within a port, and we present this as a time series so you can see how it has changed over time and how different ports compare to each other. And so what we see there is that the two most active ports are Cape May and Reedville, Virginia. And we have not yet been able to apply this kind of update to our recreational engagement plot. So just on the right there, that's directly from last year, the recreational engagement information. We're hoping to be able to change that to a time series format so we can do kind of similar analyses and interpretations as we've been able to do with the commercial port activity plot. We've also have included some information from the crew survey this year. So the crew survey shows inconsistent job satisfaction as well as signs of aging of the fleet. And for these communities that are identified as being highly commercially or recreationally engaged or active, we look at the census-derived vulnerability indices, and there's a couple of those communities that do come out in the medium high to high designation in the census-derived vulnerability indicators. So that's Bronx, Hampton Bays, Newport News, and Morehead City. So we also look at the types of species being caught and whether they are vulnerable to climate change. So basically, if a community is catching a lot of species that are very sensitive to environmental variability, such as temperature change, that is a sign that the community might be less able to adapt or might be more impacted by climate change. And on average, Mid-Atlantic's community Mid-Atlantic community landings are composed of species that are moderately sensitive to environmental variability. However, the revenue is coming from species that are highly sensitive to environmental variability. And if we look at the specific breakdown, we can see that there's a lot of communities in the Chesapeake Bay, especially, that are dependent on species that are very highly sensitive to environmental variability. So next we look at our protected species. We're meeting our objectives of maintaining bycatch below thresholds. For harbor porpoise, we are seeing a decrease in bycatch, possibly due to decrease in the overlap of harbor porpoise in US waters and with US fisheries. We are also seeing that gray seal are meeting our bycatch objectives as well, despite a large increase in the gray seal population in the past few years. So thinking about our recovering our endangered populations, the North Atlantic right whale is pretty similar numbers to last year. Although the mortality is still above the recovery rate, there's still concerns about being able to recover the species, especially needing to consider interactions between right whales and fixed gear fisheries and other activities, anthropogenic activities in the water. We also see that there's 3 continuing unusual mortality events that have been ongoing, as well as the increasing gray seal population that I mentioned. So circling back to what I mentioned at the beginning about our new framing of fishery and ecosystem stability, we are using kind of a different framework to assess whether the system is stable or not stable. So we're looking at that through 3 characteristics. So volatility, how much do we expect the system to change year to year? Is that a predictable change? Is it random? Adaptive capacity, can the system respond to change? Does it have the capacity to kind of buffer itself and be resilient to change? And then third, shifts from baseline. So is the system shifting to a new status where prior conditions may no longer represent the norm or the expected conditions? So as we think about this, not stable does not mean that there is a regime shift or that things are negative. On the flip side, stable doesn't mean that there's no changes or that things are all uniformly positive. What we do mean when we say that the system is not stable, because you already know that's what I'm going to show in the next couple of slides, what we mean by that is that there are large changes in multiple ecosystem components, and those changes are potentially altering the structure or function of the ecosystem. So first, looking at the fishery, we came to the conclusion that the fishery is not stable, and that is because of the changes we see in who is fishing and how people are fishing. So from the crew survey, we saw that crews are aging, there's inconsistent job satisfaction, there's a lack of new entrants to fisheries. We saw the size and activity of fishing communities changing. And then looking at how people are fishing, we see the changes in recreational angler behavior I mentioned, the declines in state managed species, and then we see a declining fleet count, and that suggests a reduced capacity to adapt to future change. So looking at this as a whole, we determined that the Mid-Atlantic fishery, or fisheries in general, are showing signs of not being stable. Next, looking at the ecosystem, we again considered the suite of performance metrics. And what we see here is long-term changes in community composition and biomass, which would not be expected in a stable system. So on the left, I'm showing 2 metrics of diversity, so the expected number of species in the fall bottom trawl survey, and then a zooplankton diversity index. And there is time trends in both of those, which you would not expect in a stable system. You wouldn't expect a changing mix of species. Similarly, we've got some copepod, euphousid biomasses on the right, and we see, again, some trends over time, which would not be expected in a system at equilibrium. Looking at a couple more biologic trends over time, there's the fish biomass that I mentioned earlier, showing some increases in certain guilds over time. And at the same time, looking at some of the traits of those fish, we see a decline in the mean trophic level. And so, again, this is just not what you would expect to see in a stable system. And for that reason, we determined that the ecological stability is not stable. And so with that, I'll get into risks to meeting fisheries management objectives, and some of the information here also pertains to that kind of stability and trend over time question. So just a refresher, we're going to look at risks to managing spatially, risks to managing seasonally, and then risks to setting catch limits. So spatially, that's where are the fish. We see shifts in distribution. So there is a kind of northwest or northeastward shift along the coast, as well as a shift to deeper waters. We see similar shifts in cetaceans. And those changing distributions can impact spatial allocation, cross-jurisdictional management, effectiveness of bycatch reduction measures, and availability to surveys and to fisheries. Now, why are we seeing those changes? So I'm going to get into some of the potential drivers and see kind of what the other components of the ecosystem are showing us. So first, we look at what are those fish eating. So this is some center of gravity trends, some distributional trends in common diet species of managed fish. So we're looking at macrobenthos and megabenthos, so that's benthic prey items, as well as forage fish. And what we see is there's a trend actually to the southwest in the macrobenthos, and the forage fish are trending more, maybe following their food. But not all species are able to do that, or maybe have other constraints that prevent them from doing, from fully kind of going where their food is. And so these sorts of shifts in prey species could be one of the reasons why we're seeing shifts in where managed fish are showing up. Now, looking a little farther down the food web, looking at zooplankton, we also see shifts in where the zooplankton are. So there's a northeast shift in small copepods, and then on the left, that's showing a short-term, actually westward trend in Calanus. So, even farther down the food web, the food of the food is also shifting where it is. Looking at the kind of physical habitat, why is the prey shifting? We see that there are changes in the thermal conditions. So it's getting warmer over time. There's a long-term warming trend, and that is also associated with changes in oceanographic features like the Gulf Stream Index, which had been trending northward the past couple years. It has been positioned more similarly to the long-term average. However, that trend is still present. We also see some more local changes. So on the right there, that is showing the Mid-Atlantic cold pool, which on whole has been getting warmer and smaller. However, the past couple years, I mentioned, have been more similar to or even cooler than average. So the past couple years, we see a cold pool that is more in line with the historic average. So in thinking about these spatial changes, the main takeaway that I want to express is that we are going to continue seeing long-term trends despite the recent cooling. The recent cooling is bringing us closer to average, but we're going to continue to trend um, in the general warmer direction. And we have this new tool of the MAFMC ocean forecasts that we're working to assess for their skill at predicting episodic and anomalous events. So next, I'm going to talk about risks to managing seasonally. So this is when events are happening. So we are also seeing some shifts in biological life cycle events. And that is important because fishing seasons and management measures typically rely on alignment with the life cycle of the fish of interest. And so we have some limited evidence of shifts in spawning in certain species that is showing yellowtail flounder and haddock having some shifts in their spawning timing. We also see changes in when migratory species are showing up. So tuna are showing up earlier, whereas some whales are showing up later. So these are all signs that the seasonal timing of events is maybe no longer or is maybe shifting from kind of the long-term pattern. And so, why is this happening? We look at the thermal habitat, and what we see is that there are changes in the physical characteristics of the ocean. So, the top left there is showing essentially the length of the summer, the thermal transition time between spring transition and fall transition, and that is showing that the summer is getting longer even in the past couple years when many sea surface and bottom temperatures have been cooler, the summer is still a bit longer than average. We are generally seeing that the cold pool persistence, how long it lasts, has been declining, although the last couple years have been more similar to average, although that has happened in the past where the cold pool has a couple years more similar to average and then kind of continues to trend into the shorter duration. So looking at how that might be impacting some of the bottom of the food web, we have bloom timing on the right there. And what that is showing is there's a declining trend in chlorophyll in September and an increasing trend in chlorophyll in January. And that indicates that the fall bloom is potentially shifting in timing. And so that's a major event that a lot of species kind of depend on. And so these types of phenological shifts could have cascading impacts up the food web and into affecting managed species. So next, I'm going to cover risks to setting catch limits. So these are essentially things that affect the productivity of our managed fisheries or the condition of managed fisheries. So on the left, that's showing fish condition, essentially how fat the fish are. So for a given length, is the fish fatter or skinnier than expected? And what we see there is that in the early 1990s, at the beginning of that time period, a lot of the fish were in the high to very high classification, whereas there's a dip in the aughts, and now some but not all fish have returned to being more in the high to very high amount of conditions. So that shows that potentially there's some species that are just skinnier than they used to be, so the fish are smaller. Now, we also look at how many fish there are through two different ways of looking at small fish to large fish anomaly. So on the top right, that is a productivity anomaly that's calculated from the Bottom Trawl Survey. It's the small fish per large fish. So in the more recent years, there's not as many small fish given the number of large fish that we are observing. And that indicates that there's not as many new fish coming into the populations. When we look at the stock assessment data, we see a similar story. So the bottom right there is showing the recruitment anomaly from the stock assessments. And again, that's showing that there's not as much recruitment in recent years compared to earlier in the time series, compared to the 1980s and 1990s. So overall suggesting that the productivity of managed species is lower. Okay, why are we seeing that? Well, we kind of looked at where the food is, but now we're looking at how much food is there. So, if there are changes in the quality and abundance of diet, that could cascade into impacts on managed species. So, what we see is a decline in forage fish biomass, as well as a decline in macrobenthos biomass, although we do see an increase in megabenthos. And so there's just some changes to diet, and this potentially very likely is one of the factors influencing the productivity of managed species. So looking at why do we see these changes in diet, kind of peeling back the layers, going farther down the food web, looking at the lower trophic levels, we see that primary production, so phytoplankton and chlorophyll, uh, does not have a trend over time, although there is a bit of variability. However, when we look at zooplankton, we see that there has been a decline in small copepods in the fall, whereas there's been an increase in euphausids over the same season, the fall. And so there's some shifts in the kind of zooplankton composition and mix, and that could be changing the overall quality of food. Looking at fish traits, we see that we are tending towards having fish that are smaller at maturity, grow faster, are occupying a lower trophic level. So all of this is kind of signaling that there's changes to the system productivity because there's a changing mix of species. And then finally, looking at some physical habitat, we look at ocean acidification because that can impact several species of interest. 2025 was not an extreme year for ocean acidification. There was kind of minimal episodes. However, another sort of habitat-related indicator that we've developed is an advection index. So this is showing how much water is going off the shelf or on the shelf. And that matters because there's larvae in that water. So what the time series there on the left is showing is that in the shallow and deep water bands, water is more likely to leave shore in June over time. And so that could potentially have an impact on how many larvae are able to make it into the adult populations. So, to summarize, there's kind of a lot of different factors that go into the system productivity. We are seeing shifts in the environment as well as shifts in productivity. And that highlights the need to be very cautious about which assumptions and expected future states you consider in making decisions. Next, I'm just going to go through a bit of information on offshore wind development. So this year we broke down the data in a bit of a different way. There's kind of so there's 6 what we're calling active projects, 6 projects with turbines in the water, and so we focused on those in assessing our indicators this year because the construction timeline of the other projects is highly uncertain. So we break down revenue from those lease areas and look at which species have revenue coming from those areas and which ports have revenue coming from those 6 active wind lease areas, which I should have mentioned is on Nantucket Shoals, New York Bight, as well as Virginia. So there's kind of spread across the coast. So when we look at revenue on the species level, there is in some cases a fairly large amount of being taken from those regions based on historic data. However, as a percentage of the entire fishery, it is fairly low. And it's a similar story on the port level. When we look at the revenue coming from those 6 active lease areas, that's the orange on the bar plots there, that revenue tends to be quite low. So moving on to our highlights, this is a section that we've been working to expand. Like I mentioned, we solicit observations from various colleagues, contributors, fishing industry partners, and we try to synthesize all of those to give additional context that maybe isn't captured in our data streams, or our data hasn't caught up to being able to fully reflect some of these observations. Like I mentioned, we've got our email address, we've got our QR code. So we're really trying to kind of broaden our engagement here. So what we saw this year, like I mentioned, is the cooler Northeast shelf in general. So we saw that the cold pool is well developed, more similar to the long-term average. We've also have been seeing in recent years that the contributions of Labrador slope water and warm slope water have been more similar to the long-term average. So some kind of underlying oceanographic patterns sort of that reflect these cooler conditions. Looking through our observations that we got from fishing community, we saw comments on the timing, location, and abundance of species. And I want to highlight that that is the framework we look at our risks through, the risks to managing seasonally, risks to managing spatially, and risks to setting catch limits. So the comments we got were kind of all along those different categories. So there's delayed migration of some species, absence of some species, a good year for other species, particularly billfish. In fact, the weather or the temperatures were so cold over the winter that there were reports of cold stunned fish and like cold temperature related fish kills in the Chesapeake. Also, some species seeing higher abundance as well as wider distribution. Scallop survival in the elephant trunk region, and then even Arctic copepods being observed in the Gulf of Maine. And so the takeaway here is that we seem to be mostly meeting our biological objectives, right? Most stocks are meeting their biomass and fishing targets. Ecosystem conditions are changing in ways that could impact future productivity. And kind of question for discussion or food for thought is how the MAFMC forecasts could be used to inform management decisions. However, looking on the system level, are our system level objectives being met? We are seeing declining seafood production and revenue. However, those declines are mostly in state and New England managed species, not as much in mid-Atlantic species. Um, we are seeing that community level revenue comes from species with high climate vulnerability. We also see aging of the fleet, declining fleet count, things that suggest that there's a reduced capacity to adapt to change. And we see long-term changes in the ecosystem productivity and community composition that suggest a potential shift in the system. So one final question to think about is whether there are reference points, desired states, or performance metrics that we could incorporate into this report to kind of get at that question of are our system level objectives being met? So with that, I want to thank all of the contributors. The State of the Ecosystem is a huge effort made possible by lots and lots of people, and we have all of our resources linked here. Can email me with questions or just ask me a few questions now. Thank you.
Thank you, Abby. Great job. I think the torch was clearly successfully passed. That was a great premiere. So I'll look around the table first. Questions from, we have a few hands, so I'll go to Michelle and then Lisa. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Abby, for a great presentation. I agree with the chairman, just a wonderful passing of the torch. So we're just really glad to have you here in person. But I think in terms of your question with respect to the MAFMC forecast, so when you initially showed that graph of, the historic bottom temperatures and then the MAFMC, predictions in there, I was thinking that it could be useful or at least interesting to see, that graph overlaid with either, biomass levels of different, managed species and even catch levels of different managed species. I mean, certainly catch levels are constrained by ACLs, but, just thinking about what those biomass trends have looked like for different managed species over time, and would probably be a pretty huge lift to try to pull all that from assessments, at this point. But I think, maybe each council could focus on like a top 5 or something like that. So I would certainly find that interesting and useful. And I guess, in thinking about some of the, so that's one potential observation. And then just thinking about, the ecosystem stability and, the report noting that there appear to be, these long-term systemic shifts away from our norms, and I'm thinking about things like our, like one of the graphs you show is always like a recruitment index from assessments. And so when that's being calculated, I know for some of our assessments, when the SSC has looked at recruitment and they're going through their ABC, OFL CV setting process, sometimes they will apply a different recruitment approach to coming up with the ABC. I think I'm thinking of mackerel, where there's been some different methods that have been used, versus like the entire time series or application of different long-term and short-term stances. So I'm wondering how are those taken into account when you're developing that recruitment index at all? And, then sort of plans for incorporating some of that into future assessments.
Yeah, so the recruitment index is not for projected, for projections from the stock assessment. It's just the historic looking one. So it's kind of the determined recruitment deviation from the model. I'm sorry, I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I think it doesn't necessarily reflect any like stanzas that were applied in determining what those recruitment deviations are. It's just kind of the numerical output.
I feel like there could be some useful synergy between those two things, what's coming out of the assessment, which is what you all are using, compared to what, say, the SSC sees as actually reflecting reality when it comes to the optimism of those recruitment outputs.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yes. Yes, it would be interesting to look at kind of the stanza or like average expected recruitment over those different time periods and see how we stack up to that. Yeah. Thank you.
Lisa, you had your hand up.
Great presentation. Thank you. I was noticing on the chart where you were saying some of the fish were fat, some were thin, that in 1998 in the bottom left, there was a whole chunk that were kind of fat, and then as it moved through the middle, it evened out. And then as it got towards, I can't remember where in the 2000s, they got fat at the top. And I was wondering if you took note of the coastal population in 98 and the nursery, where the fish nurseryed, and how the coastal population increased as time went on and baby boomers started retiring like they are now and coming to the beach and really living, near those nursery sections. If there was, as Michelle said, an overlay of population from 98 to then and where they are, and if that trend could be tied in with the fish and their size, their abundance, all of that. It
Yeah,
might be
thank
interesting
you.
to see that because certainly the coastal population affects all of that.
Yeah, thank you for the suggestion. I don't think we've really parsed the condition into like groups of fish like that, but I like that idea, and that's something we'll look into.
That also, and that also might help you in your prediction. That's why I brought that up. Because when you said, how are we going to make a future prediction, you could see where people are going to fill in the coast because they're certainly not moving into middle America. They're coming to the coast. And that's going to affect the fish and their migrations with all the grass and the septic and building and everything. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And I think that goes. The same would be true for certain watersheds like the Chesapeake Bay. Just the amount of development part of the changes. I'm going to go online. Paul Rego, go ahead, Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I just wanted to follow up and amplify on Michelle's comment. First, I think that it's an excellent one in terms of providing additional information for definition of future recruitment. Generally, that focus right now is on a within assessment kind of focus. So whatever, if we haven't seen a big year class for 15 years, it probably isn't a good idea to assume that we're going to start seeing them in the next 3. So that is sort of a central feature of this. And so if you can support that kind of sort of ad hoc example with some information, not only from the species of interest, but also other species, then I think you have a much stronger case to build with respect to making those forecasts. And in terms of utility, I think it works at least 3 levels. The first is with the individual lead a stock assessment person who, and the peer review process that they support, to sort of identify recent trends. The second is with the council staff person who's assigned to the species, who can then sort of interact with the center, provide refinement of those future recruitment stanzas, and then update or enhance the projection. And then finally, it rests with the SSC, which I think will be in a much better position in terms of identifying not only recruitment stanzas, but also having some coherence across the stock assessment process as well as the ecosystem levels. So thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Yep, thank you for the suggestion. I'm very interested in kind of connecting the species level patterns with what we see in the ecosystem as a whole. So yeah, that's a very interesting line of study. We'll look into it.
Thank you.
Joe Grist.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Have a great presentation. I want to go back to really early in your presentation. You're talking about community vulnerability, and I went back into the report to look at table 4, and because you had called out, highly vulnerable Bronx, Newport News, Hampton Bays, Ocean City at the top of the list. Could you explain just briefly a little bit more what goes into making that determination? Because I'm seeing your categories, personal description, population composition, poverty, but there's some communities in here that I could make an argument that I think they're more vulnerable than this table shows. Could you just explain a little bit about that metric?
Yes, I will explain to the best of my ability, though first I should say this is a metric provided by our social sciences branch. So those categories, they're census derived from census data. I can't speak in detail to the methods, but I think perhaps some of the reason why you are seeing things or that are slightly different than expected is that the definition of community is particular, which I think has been a bit of a difficulty with this data, is that the census doesn't necessarily define the community in the same way as like the fishing port you would think of. So there's some like communities that are quite large, and so even though there is components that you would think might be more vulnerable, when you kind of average it out, it comes out lower on the scale. But if you want, more of the methods, I can connect you with some of our social scientists.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. Again, good presentation, good report.
Thank you.
Okay, not seeing any other hands around the table, and we're pretty close on time, but I do want to, considering the usefulness and importance of the report, I do want to give the public a chance to see if we have any hands either on the room or online. Okay, not seeing any. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And we will move on to our next agenda item. And Brandon, I think that's you. So we'll look at the EAFM risk assessment report. Go ahead.
Great. Thanks, Mr. Chair. I will wait for Stephen to pull up the presentation, and thanks to Abby for coming down today. It's always good and bad to follow the state of the ecosystem presentation as I go into the risk assessment, but I think it makes a lot of sense to structure it the way we do, because you'll see a lot of connections between our risk assessment and the state of the ecosystem report. All right, so I always like to start out on this in terms of why we do the risk assessment, where does it come from? So the risk assessment is the first step in our EAFM structured decision process that is actually embedded in our EAFM guidance document. And it's intended as a way to incorporate species, fleet, habitat, socioeconomic, and sort of ecosystem information into the council's existing processes and management decisions. And so there are lots of topics and issues and challenges that the council may be facing at any particular time. And the risk assessment is really intended for you all to be able to look across species, look across your sectors, and identify those things that are those high risk areas that you're beginning to see, and if it's worth diving into and doing some more analysis on. So that's the initial intent of what the risk assessment tries to do and lays out in this process that we've developed. And I also like to remind you that we've actually gone through this entire structured decision framework one time. And so the initial risk assessment, and I don't plan to step into all of these details, many of you around the table have been involved in different components of this entire cycle, but I just want to highlight in terms of how we get from step one, the risk assessment, and sort of what comes out at the very end of everything. And so we started out with that first risk assessment that identified summer flounder as our high risk fishery. We moved into conceptual model development where we were looking at ecosystem relationships and functions and identifying how things are connected in the ecosystem to identify our priority management question that we have. And out of that, we identified recreational summer flounder discards as our priority issue, and how can we reduce them and increase recreational opportunities. And so we moved that into management strategy evaluation to evaluate that particular question. And out of that management strategy evaluation, we developed our recreational demand model that we use now for rec setting, rec spec setting for summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass. We also utilize that management strategy evaluation modeling framework as a basis for evaluating the alternatives in the rec measure setting process framework that you all approved last year. So there's a lot of practical applications that have come out of this entire process that the council uses on an annual basis, and it all starts with the risk assessment. And similar to the State of the Ecosystem report, the risk assessment gets updated annually. And while the State of the Ecosystem report provides the broader context of what's going on within the ecosystem and how those sort of activities might be impacting council management objectives, the risk assessment takes a lot of the information that's in the State of the Ecosystem report, but is more focused on the council stocks and the risks and the risk elements that the council's identified and what might be going on over time. So we have this annual report that provides a snapshot of what's going on this year. So you have a summary table that I'll get to at the end of this report that gives you sort of a cheat sheet of all of our stocks and all of our different fisheries, and you can see where risks are taking place within that given year. But also allows you to look at risks over time and how things may be changing. Either more risks for a particular stock or particular sector, or less risk, and maybe that's telling into over time. So it gives us this sort of time frame to evaluate how risks may be changing within our different stocks. And it not only allows us to look at changes in our stocks, but you can see there's a few different NAs in the 2022 column here. Those are risk elements that we did not have in 2022 that we do now have in 2026. So it also allows us to see how the risk assessment itself is changing over time and the new information that we're beginning to incorporate. So I don't want to get into a lot of details here, but the 2023 comprehensive review really is what the foundation of our current risk assessment report looks like and how we update it on an annual basis. So I just wanted to remind the council of this review that we did. It was led by our Ecosystem and Ocean Planning Committee and the AP back in 2023, and was really just to, are we capturing the right risks? The risks that we're seeing now, are there new risks that the council wants to be monitoring, or are there risks that we should be anticipating that we want to make sure we're watching so that nothing sort of catches us off guard? So that was really the primary driver of that comprehensive review. The EOP identified 43 different risk elements at the time. We pared that down to 28 risk elements that we now include in our risk assessment. 24 of those we've had for a long time since the original risk assessment, and we added 4 new risk elements into the assessment. So I just wanted to sort of, from the 2023 risk assessment, how we got to the report that I'm presenting to you today. So we had the 2023 review. In 2024, we worked with the EOP to develop the report that the council approved at the end of 2024. So that's the really comprehensive report. I don't know how, it's like 50, 60 pages long. It's pretty extensive. It goes through all of the definitions, all of the analysis that goes into supporting all of the indicators, and then all of the information that comes out and how risks are identified and specified in that. In 2025, we didn't do a whole comprehensive report. We just did a summary report. So you're just looking at changes in risks from 2025 to 2024, and any new analyses or updated information is highlighted in that report. And so the 2026 report is the exact same way. We're just looking at what's changed from 2025. What did risk go up or go down for a particular risk element or across a suite of indicators. And so that's really what our focus is here. So everything has been updated, but we're only focusing on those things that have changed. And we also have 4 risk elements where we did provide new or updated information. So estuarine habitat, offshore wind 1, offshore wind 2. So we have two different risk elements looking at offshore wind, and then other ocean uses. And I'll get into those in a little bit of detail. And I also highlight there are a few areas, particularly some of the advances that were seen in the State of the Ecosystem report. There are areas where I think we could make some improvements for the 2027 report using some of the new indicators that we've seen in the State of the Ecosystem report. And just, I want to sort of highlight those connections between the risk assessment and the State of the Ecosystem report. They were developed really at the same time. 2016, 2017 is when both of them came online. Again, there's a lot of connections between those two reports. As I noted already, we have 28 risk elements in our risk assessment. A risk element can have anywhere from 1 to 5 indicators in them. And looking at our 2025 reports, there were 21 indicators in the State of the Ecosystem report that we used directly in the risk assessment. And there are lots of other pieces of information that are in the State of the Ecosystem report that we are utilizing, but we use them in a different way within our risk assessment. We either analyze them a little bit differently or we apply them a little bit differently. And so there's a lot of synergy between the two reports, a lot of some indicator development that happens within the risk assessment winds up in the State of the Ecosystem report in future years. And so there's a lot of synergies that take place there, which has been really beneficial for both reports, I think. And this is my final reminder of sort of context. This is sort of all the different components that make up the risk assessment. So we have these 4 different risk components. So we have the risk element. Those are our 28 risk elements. We have a definition, which is really any aspect that may threaten from the council achieving its objectives that it may have for a particular fishery or for a stock. Those could be biological objectives. They could be socioeconomic objectives. We have a definition that specifies what's at risk. And usually most of our definitions are phrased in terms of achieving optimal yield. So what's the risk for not achieving optimal yield for a particular issue? We have an indicator, which can be any observation. It could be quantitative or qualitative information that tells us about the risk. And then we have criteria that says, well, how much risk is there? Given the information that we have in the indicators, how much risk does that align with? And then we have those 28 different risk elements that are grouped into either ecological, socioeconomic, or management elements. Okay. So with all of that sort of background and context, I'll dive into the actual 2026 report. And again, here I'm just going to focus on those changes that we see in 2026 compared to 2025 and any new information that we may have available for some of those risk elements. So we'll start off with the ecological risk elements. So what we saw in terms of decreased risk, we had a number of stock assessments in 2025 that gave us updated information on our fishing mortality status or biomass status. So summer flounder is no longer, overfishing isn't occurring for summer flounder in our 2025 stock assessment. So that decreased risk there. We got a new assessment for blue line tilefish. Now we don't have a fishing mortality associated with blue line tilefish, so that changes its sort of where it fits within our risk ranking criteria, actually to less risk, so we don't have a definition for it. And then Atlantic mackerel is no longer overfished, so its biomass status has improved, and so that results in decreased risk. The one area of increased risk that we found in our ecosystem elements is with ecosystem productivity. So this is one of our elements where we have 5 different indicators that we use that's really looking at some of our lower trophic level components that Abby talked about a lot in the State of the Ecosystem report. And so here, 3 of those 5 indicators showed significant trends. Those trends could be increasing or decreasing. That's not really necessarily, doesn't mean that they're all going down necessarily, but it means that there is change going on, even if it's increasing or positive change. So we saw changes, significant changes or significant trends in primary productivity, large-bodied copepods, and the forage fish index. And so since we have 3 out of the 5 indicators showing increasing, significant trends, that resulted in higher risk. And I just did want to note here for blue line tilefish, I don't count that as changing their risk, but in previous risk assessments, under the climate and distribution risk elements, we use the species climate vulnerability assessment to inform that. We don't actually, it was never done for blue line tilefish. We applied the golden tilefish information to blue line tilefish. It's probably a safe assumption to do that, but we are going to be getting new climate vulnerability assessments for all mid-Atlantic stocks later this year. And we'll have golden tilefish specific climate vulnerability assessment and a blue line tilefish. So I just separated that out for now, and we'll have new information to inform all of our species next year for the report. And then we have one new updated ecological element. This is on estuarine habitat. And so we have the original risk assessment used the National Coastal Condition Assessment, which was the information that comes out of the EPA that looks at water and habitat quality at the estuary level. And so that's the information that we had used in our risk assessment every year. It was a static report. It was a report that was developed in 2012. And so our risk rankings never change for estuarine habitat because we use that one sort of static report. That report's fairly coarse. It's at the estuarine level. It's fairly stale since it's from 2012 information. And we have a lot of new tools and information in regards to habitat now, thanks to a lot of the work from Jessica and Tori and others through the Northeast Regional Habitat Assessment. We took their habitat crosswalk, which is that figure there on the left-hand side. And that's just one example. I think that's for black sea bass. But the habitat crosswalks incorporate a bunch of information: the habitat climate vulnerability assessment, the species climate vulnerability assessment, the Atlantic Coastal Fish Habitat Partnership habitat matrix. And so it takes all of that information together. And so now we have estuarine habitat information by species, by life history, and their occupancy and use of different habitat types and the vulnerability of that habitat type. So we're able to look across the different estuarine habitats that are available that a particular species may use at different life histories. And we look across all of those to come up with a new risk ranking. And so utilizing that information, 4 stocks actually decreased in risk. Summer flounder, scup, black sea bass, and bluefish. Their risk ranking dropped from high to moderate high, and then 2 stocks actually increased in risk: Atlantic mackerel and spiny dogfish. Moving on to our social and economic risk elements. So in 2026, we actually did not see any decreased risks in any of our socioeconomic risk elements. And one of them increased in risk, and Abby talked about this quite a bit in the State of the Ecosystem report. This is in regards to commercial value. So this is our current risk element is commercial revenue. And previously, we just saw a long-term decline in commercial revenue within the Mid-Atlantic. The latest information that we have now shows a significant short decline in the short term over the last 10 years. So that changes its risk ranking to high risk because we're seeing this decline over in recent time period. And I just wanted to highlight, some of these other indicators that are available now that were identified in the State of the Ecosystem report, more of like looking at profits, which is something the Ecosystem and Ocean Planning Committee were really interested in looking at, moving away from just looking at revenue, but what are the actual profits within our commercial fleet. And so these aren't formally incorporated into the risk assessment. I think these are an avenue we can explore over the next year and begin to incorporate some of these profit indicators into the risk assessment for next year. And then finally, I just wanted to flag this one, the fishing community vulnerability. Joe had asked about this particular indicator. This is a risk element that we look at. And so nothing formally changed this year, but I just wanted to highlight there are some areas where that Abby had presented, they've really been developing some of these indicators. So the current risk assessment utilizes these community social vulnerability indicators, which are really these census-based indicators that have historically provided just snapshots on vulnerability. So But the Ecosystem and Ocean Planning Committee were really interested in looking at time series indicators to see how things may be changing over time, just instead of just focusing in on one particular year. And so now we do have these indicators, particularly some of these indicators looking at the one that's up on the screen is looking at the proportion of communities that are reliant on climate vulnerable stocks. And so, and you can see how that's changing over time. And so I think these are, again, indicators that we can work with the center and work with the Ecosystem and Ocean Planning Committee later this year or early next year, and how we want to incorporate these kind of indicators into the risk assessment next year. And into the final section of management risk elements, we have a few that we saw decreased risk. So fishing mortality control, which is really looking at whether or not we're exceeding the ABC. So illic squid, that we did not see any overages over the last 5 years from 2020 to 2024. So that decreased in risk. Our discards for commercial summer flounder, recreational summer flounder, and recreational scup have also been changing and less so. The summer flounder commercial discards have been declining and relatively stable now and make up a lower proportion of the overall catch. And our recreational fisheries for summer flounder and scup have a pretty low fishing mortality, hook and release mortality rate, and comprising a lower proportion of the total dead catch as well. And then in regards to allocation, so last year, the council and the board removed any allocation considerations in the sector separation amendment that's being worked on. So there are no allocation considerations right now by the council. And so we have low risk in terms of that particular risk element now. We do have increased risk for a couple of areas. Fishing mortality control, again, this is, whether or not we've been over or below the ABC over the last 5 years and how much over or under we've been. And so Atlantic mackerel saw, we exceeded the ABC in 2024 by 13%. So that did increase risk a little bit for that particular stock. And then for discards for commercial scup, 2024 were the second highest commercial discards in the last 10 years, and they are making up a greater proportion of the total dead catch for scup. And then chub mackerel, it's not necessarily discards are an issue per se, but the discards really make up a highly variable proportion of the overall catch for chub mackerel, and whether or not the information that we have on discards is really meaningful, I think sort of demonstrates there's some risk because we don't have a lot of information in regards to discards and what they actually may mean. So we do have a few updated elements, and these weren't really anything substantial, but again, we wanted to be consistent with the State of the Ecosystem report. So as Abby had indicated there's a lot changing in the world of offshore wind. And so they did calculations that only looked at those wind lease areas where there are wind turbines in the water. And so we wanted to do a similar analysis. We wanted to be consistent. So we changed our analysis here and only looked at those six wind lease areas with wind turbines in the water as well. So we're looking for offshore wind one, we're looking at sort of the biological implications of offshore wind and looking at the spatial overlap of stock distribution abundance within the wind lease areas, and we compare them across 2 different time periods. And so in this analysis, we're comparing 2015 to 2019, looking at the spatial overlap then compared to the 2020 to 2024 and seeing if those things are changing, if we're seeing more or less abundance in the wind lease areas during those 2 time periods. But going to only looking at 6 of the wind lease areas, most of those we are seeing, and actually I wanted to point out, we did have a weighting scheme for this particular risk element, where depending upon where we were, if it was under construction versus just in the planning phase, we had some weighting. Well, since all of them are either under construction or in operation, we removed the weighting scheme. And so given all of that, really the most risk went down in most, either the rankings stayed the same or they went down for a few species. The only one that we saw an increase was in butterfish. And actually we saw really large change in butterfish between 2015 to 2019 to 20 to 2024. There was a lot more butterfish found in the wind lease areas during those 2 time blocks, and that was the only one that we saw. And so that resulted in higher risk for that particular stock. Similarly, for offshore wind 2 is looking at the risks to offshore wind development on the data and science quality and on fishery access. So can as they had historically. And so we have 2 different indicators that look at the spatial overlap of the survey and the wind lease areas and the landings and revenue that are coming out of the wind lease areas. And the analysis was done the same as we've done it previously again, but we're only utilizing the 6 wind lease areas that have wind turbines in the water. And so that resulted in not a whole lot of change. If anything, things went down. So surf clam and black sea bass, the risk went down. It did go up on ocean quahog, but that was really sort of a minor adjustment. I think it was showing in previous years there was no overlap. Now there's a little bit of overlap, but I'm looking at my notes here. When you look at the spatial overlap, it's less than 2% across all managed species, and the amount of landings coming out of the wind lease areas is less than 3% of the total landings for a particular stock. So there's not a whole lot coming out or sort of interaction going on within the fewer wind lease areas that we're considering now. And then our other ocean activities. So this one we didn't change the analysis here, but again, thanks to all of the work by the Northeast Regional Habitat team, we now have, we utilize the NERA habitat distribution model. And previously we only had that available for a couple of stocks. We now have that model has been built out for all of our mid-Atlantic stocks, except for, I think, blue line tilefish and chub mackerel. Sorry for those 2 stocks, but we don't have models yet for those 2. So we've been able to update the analysis here. So this is really looking at sort of the risk to fishery displacement from non-fishing activities. And this does not include offshore wind, but this includes the deep sea coral protection areas, the Northeast canyons and monuments, the Stellwagen Bank Sanctuary, shipping fairways, and other sort of restricted areas due to military activities. And we also include artificial reefs. So when you look at that, the spatial overlap is fairly small, particularly when you look across all of those different non-fishing activities. The highest was for a black sea bass at 9 and 9.8% of sort of the habitat distribution overlaps with those non-fishing activities. And so they all come out as low risk when you look across all of our fisheries and sectors. And so you take all of that information together, and it comes up with our summary table to give you a sense of, this is the sort of the snapshot that the council is given every year so that you can look across all of our different fisheries and sectors and see where the risks or lack of risks may be. And so overall, 79% of the risk rankings fall in either the low or low moderate, which is actually an increase from 2025. That means there's more risk elements in the lower risk. So in general, there's lower risk across our council managed stocks in 2026 compared to 2025. And I look back at 2024, it's similar. There's less risk in 26 compared to 2024. But in general, in general, the ones with the highest risk are distribution shifts, which I don't think is any surprise. We have lots of stocks in the mid-Atlantic that are subject to changes in stock distribution. Regulatory complexity comes out as fairly high risk. We have fairly complex regs within our system. And then if you look across those ecosystem elements, that one table there, most of those are in the moderate, high, or high risks. I think this is something that Abby had pointed out in her presentation, is something that the SSC had highlighted, that when you look at our stocks in general, at the species specific level, things generally are looking, there's not a lot of risk. So things look okay, but when you look across the ecosystem, there are things that are at risk. So there are some underlying dynamics that are taking place within our fisheries with across the ecosystem, that may be driving some things that are probably worth investigating. So I think that's probably the biggest take home to me in terms of how the state of the ecosystem and our risk assessment sort of align and tell the story, is that individually things are okay, but there are many things changing in the environment. And when you look across the ecosystem, there are greater risks that are taking place there. And so just a couple more slides thinking about areas for improvement for our 2027 report. There are a few different risk elements that I envision will have some additional work being done over the course of the next year. Some of those are in offshore habitat. None of those changed really from 25 to 26. Those have primarily been developed through the research track assessments. We have paused research track assessments, particularly for single species, but there is some information there where we could potentially pull out some work on other stocks that did go through research track assessments, where we could find some offshore habitat information. I talked about those fishing community vulnerability, the risk element, and the new indicators that we have there, and how do we want to integrate those. The climate and distribution shifts, we're going to have our new climate vulnerability assessment rankings later this year, so we'll be able to incorporate those. And then that commercial value risk element. So now we have these profitability indices, and how do we want to integrate those into the risk assessment for next year. And then I just wanted to touch upon and this is an IRA project that we have that's looking at indicators and how we can integrate indicators more holistically, more directly into our council management process and into council management decisions. And so we've been working with Sarah Gachis and Gavin Fay on this project. I won't spend a whole lot of time, but we've had a number of workshops already with council members, our SSC, the EOP committee, and AP members, sort of helping us step through what are our priority management decisions that we think could be made better by incorporating indicator information. And so what we've come up with through the series of workshops so far is we're going to look at indicator information to inform our risk policy and in the catch and quota setting process. And so at our last workshop in March, we identified some desirable and undesirable states and potential targets and thresholds that we might want to look at with using indicators. And so the contract team is now sort of looking at the information we have available, the indicators that we could develop, and they're going to do some simulation testing to see how they perform. How does the risk policy perform utilizing indicator information? How would catch and quota setting change under the utilization of indicators? So that's happening now. We plan to have a workshop later this year to look at the results of the simulation testing and how we want to move forward with utilizing indicators in some of our other council management processes. And so lastly, there's no action required on the risk assessment. It sort of provides context, I think, to the State of the Ecosystem report. But if you all have any overall questions and takeaways about the report, there's particularly on the new information that was presented this year. I did change the summary report some with Sarah and Garrett DePiper leaving the center, who were really instrumental in developing the risk assessment. I have took over sort of the formatting and putting the report together. So things have changed a little bit from previous reports. So if some of those new sections are informative, any feedback on that would be really good. If you have the 2027 report, I did have that slide on other areas that I'm thinking about making improvements to it. And again, so is this report providing the intended information and value to the council? So any questions or feedback that you may have on that would be much appreciated. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Great, thank you. Job well done. And I do want to, I'll start with a comment, and that is, I feel like so often we either have you or Jason here and we say we are way behind schedule, please hurry up. So I always appreciate when we give you guys the time you need to present. And so I'll ask around the table for either questions or comments on the risk assessment report. Michelle, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Brandon, for a great presentation. And can you go back to the slide where you had the things that you were thinking about for next year's report? Yeah, so I mean, I really appreciate the effort that went into development of the profitability indices. So I think, you know, that's something we talked a lot about at the EOP committee level, and in advisors particularly were interested in that. And this is digging back into brain cells that I've probably already destroyed, but did we talk about a similar indicator, at least for the for hire sector of the recreational fishery? I'm wondering if that might not be something you could just sort of put in the bucket to think about down the road. I think it seems like with some of the challenges that the for hire sector is facing in a lot of our fisheries, that something like that could be valuable to future conversations. And then definitely totally supportive of incorporating the new fishing community vulnerability indicators into the future report. And I think, you know, when I see those and I look at, you know, I think about the what Abby talked about in the State of the Ecosystem report, just maybe the instability in the system, and that there are changes that are going to be happening. I think those indicators are even more important than ever before. And so I guess maybe also to Abby, I guess I would put in a plug for, in terms of the to-do lists that you all have updated, like that focus. It looks like it's something that hasn't been started yet, and I know resources are slim, but looking at those indicators of regime change, I think is probably going to be, now that we've identified things are kind of unstable, how can we definitively identify regime change? And I feel like this is something that the SSC talked about as well, but I'll stop there. Great job. I think this report becomes just more informative each year, you know, and the synergies with the State of the Ecosystem report are valuable.
Not seeing any other hands around the table or online. Are there any questions on the report from the public? Okay, not seeing any. Well, thanks again, Brenda. I will say, I have one last brief comment. The 2023 review was so comprehensive that it found me seeking new committee assignments in 2024 because I was pouring out from that. So I apologize to the other EOP committee members that I bailed on after that. But it was very thorough. And as you mentioned, I really appreciate that the work for our habitat stuff is able to be incorporated. So thank you all for all the work that was done on that, and of course for the State of the Ecosystem report. What I'd like to do now is take a break. So let's take a 15-minute break, and we'll reconvene just a little bit early, I think, still for our next agenda item. All right, if folks can find their seats, we'll get started in a minute. Thanks, everyone. We have one more agenda item today. We have Julia and Hayden will walk us through the vessel baseline evaluation. And whenever you two are ready, I'll turn it over. So go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, everybody. So Hayden and I will both present on this ongoing evaluation of vessel baseline restrictions, which the Mid-Atlantic and New England councils are working on together. So this presentation will summarize the purpose of the evaluation, the timeline, we'll summarize what the current vessel baseline regulations are, we'll summarize some preliminary permit data that we've been able to look at so far, we'll summarize comments that we recently received from the advisory panels and the public, and then we'll discuss next steps. So jumping right into it, this evaluation is something that the Mid-Atlantic Council agreed to as part of your 2026 priorities, and it was also a recommended action in the Council's response to Executive Order 14276, which was the one on restoring American seafood competitiveness, and it was similarly prioritized by the New England Council, and both councils agreed that this should be an evaluation of the current vessel baseline restrictions with the goal of informing whether to initiate a joint management action to consider potentially revising those restrictions. And the council's tasked staff with considering things such as challenges in replacing vessels and engines under the current restrictions and providing flexibility to upgrade or replace vessels and engines, for example, for increased efficiency or safety, without compromising the ability to manage overall fleet capacity. So this is the timeline for the evaluation. At the beginning of this year, there was a work group formed, and that work group includes staff from both councils, the Mid-Atlantic and New England, as well as staff from the GARFO Sustainable Fisheries Division and the Permits Office. I believe some of the other work group members are listening in, depending on how the discussion goes and what you want to hear more about later. So at the end of May, we held 3 advisory panel meetings and associated comment period to collect more input. We'll summarize that in a little bit more detail in a few slides. And then that brings us to today. We're providing an update to you all on progress with the evaluation so far. And then the New England Council is going to get a similar update at their meeting next week. And then for the rest of the summer after today, we will take into consideration the input and guidance provided by both councils, as well as the input that we recently received from the advisory panels and the public. And we will work to finalize the evaluation with the goal of bringing the complete report, final report, to the September New England Council meeting and the October Mid-Atlantic Council meeting, so that it can kind of feed into the discussions for both councils' priorities for 2027. Because as you know, you all talk about your draft priorities in October and then finalize those priorities in December. And then if at that point in time, later this year, when you're talking about your priorities for the future, if you agree to initiate a management action on this topic, then the work on that management action would happen in 2027 and beyond. So just to reiterate that right now, we're not at the point of having a management action yet. So we are not looking at specific management alternatives or anything like that. Rather, we're just doing an initial evaluation to inform your later decision about whether or not to initiate a management action. So next, some very brief history on the vessel baseline restrictions. This is just high-level overview. There's a lot more details that we could go into here. But these restrictions on increases in the length and horsepower of vessels were originally implemented several decades ago at this point. And when they were implemented, their intent was to constrain catch in limited access fisheries. They were one of many effort controls used to try to achieve this goal. And this was prior to the use of annual catch limits and other types of management measures that we have in place right now. They were intended to control potential increases in fishing capacity for limited access fisheries managed by both councils, because there was a concern that if vessels could greatly increase in their size or horsepower, that could essentially undermine the intent of the limited access programs. And these restrictions also help to preserve the size diversity of the fleets. The specific regulations have been revised multiple times over the years for consistency across fisheries and simplified documentation and administration. But we have heard from industry participants that there are still some ongoing challenges, which we will summarize in more detail on later slides. But next, I'm going to turn it over to Hayden.
Thanks, Julia. So like Julia just mentioned, there have been changes to the vessel baseline restrictions over time. However, what you see on this slide is the vessel baseline restrictions as they currently exist. Under current regulations, a vessel's length cannot exceed 10% of the permit's baseline specifications, and a vessel's engine cannot exceed 20% of the permit's baseline specifications. So when I say baseline specifications, I'm referring to the length and horsepower of the vessel that originally held a permit when baseline restrictions first went into effect. So to provide an example of this, say I have a limited access commercial scup permit, and the baseline specs on that permit are 30 feet and 200 horsepower. My vessel, which is attached to that permit, could only be upgraded to a maximum of 33 feet in length and 240 horsepower. So again, that's within 10% of the length and 20% of the horsepower. Under current regulations, there are no restrictions on the number of times a vessel can be upgraded. So thinking back to my example, I could incrementally increase the length and horsepower of my vessel so long as I remain within 10% and 20% of my permit's baseline length and horsepower. These restrictions apply to most limited access commercial fisheries managed by the councils. And as you can see in the table on the right-hand side of this slide, the year defining a permit's baseline differs by permit type. This is because some fisheries became limited access earlier or later than others, and in 1999, the councils took action to streamline vessel baseline restrictions for several fisheries. Given the historical differences in vessel baseline restrictions across permit types, it's possible that one vessel can be attached to requirements. In situations like this, the most restrictive baseline applies, and the only way to eliminate a baseline is to sell or permanently relinquish the relevant permit. Like I mentioned before, vessel baseline restrictions apply to most limited access commercial fisheries managed by the councils. However, we also wanted to make it clear that there are permit types that are not subject to these vessel baseline restrictions, as shown on the screen here. This includes all federal recreational permit types, commercial IFQ or ITQ fisheries, other commercial open access permits, and some limited access permits, which are in that purple box on the right there. Now that we've clarified which permit types are subject to vessel baseline restrictions, let's talk about the actual number of vessels subject to these restrictions. This flowchart summarizes data from 2025, which is the most recent year of complete permit data. Starting at the top of this flowchart and working our way down, of the roughly 5,700 fishing permit suites issued by GARFO, about 1,800 have baseline restrictions. Of those permit suites, 640 are in confirmation of permit history, and 1,167 are issued to vessels. Of those 1,167 vessels, most just have one baseline length and horsepower, and 164 have multiple. The figures we're about to review include that number highlighted in the blue box. So for now, we're leaving permits in confirmation of permit history behind and just focusing on permit suites that are off the shelf in 2025. This table is our first attempt at characterizing the extent to which vessels have upgraded relative to their baselines. Like I mentioned before, this table includes 1,167 vessels or permit suites that were subject to baseline restrictions in 2025. On the left-hand side, you can see that permit types are organized by fishery, and the number of vessels within each permit type is summarized immediately next to that column. Moving over to the vessel length and vessel horsepower columns, the permit data was organized so that you can get a clear sense of whether vessels have upgraded beyond their baseline specifications. For example, looking at the first row, which is Atlantic red crab, under vessel length, data indicate that 80% of vessels with a limited access red crab permit have not upgraded beyond their baseline length, and only 20% have upgraded above that value. Across fisheries, the data show that between 18 and 33% of vessels have increased in length, and 20 to 49% have increased in horsepower relative to their baseline specifications. Interestingly, some people at the advisory panel meetings that we held this spring were surprised that these percentages were so low based on their The table on the last slide summarizes how many vessels have upgraded beyond their baseline specifications. This figure gets a bit more granular, showing how close vessels tend to be to their maximum allowable horsepower. The x-axis shows the level of horsepower for 4 groups of vessels, and the y-axis shows the number of vessels in each group. The bars are color-coded so that you can see how close vessels are to their maximum allowable horsepower. So red indicates vessels are at their maximum allowable horsepower, and as you move toward blue, you get further from that value. This graph indicates that most vessels with baselines have engines that are less than 800 horsepower, and most of those vessels are within 100 horsepower of their maximum. So that's the yellow to red values there. This figure is similar to the last bar graph, but it shows how close vessels tend to be to their maximum allowable length. Again, the x-axis here shows 4 groups of vessels, but this time organized by vessel length, and the y-axis shows the number of vessels in each group. And again, the bars are color-coded, so you can see how close vessels are to the maximum length. So red indicates they're at the maximum allowable length, and as you move toward blue, you get further from that value. And this graph indicates that most vessels with baselines are in the 31 to 60 foot range, and most of these vessels are within 5 feet of their maximum allowable length. So that's the pink to red values there. And finally, this figure shows the average age of vessels by permit type over time for the vessels with baselines. Across fisheries, the average age of vessels has increased over time, but there's an interesting lull between 2000 and 2010 when the line flattens a bit, suggesting that more vessels may have been replaced by newer vessels during that time period. In 2025, the average age of vessels ranged from 34 to 40 years. This suggests that vessels mostly are not being replaced with younger vessels.
Right, so we know we can't get the full picture of the impacts of the vessel baseline restrictions just from looking at the data. So we held 3 joint advisory panel meetings in late May, and we also accepted written comments through May 29th. These meetings were held with all the APs across both councils, and the 3 meetings covered the same information. In total, we had 34 AP members attend at least 1 meeting and 23 members of the public. We got verbal comments from 22 AP members and 8 members of the public, as well as written comments from 4 AP members and 1 member of the public. And you can see the detailed comment summary in the briefing materials, and I'll just cover some highlights now. So we heard a lot of comments about the challenges that these vessel baseline restrictions have created. Probably the challenge that we heard the most loud and clear was safety at sea. So these restrictions prevent vessels from increasing in length or horsepower beyond a certain extent. So the comments talked about how some people are forced to fish on smaller vessels or lower horsepower engines than they would ideally want to, and they make it challenging to replace vessels. So in some cases, people are fishing on older vessels than they might want to. So this is safety at sea can be especially a concern for vessels that are smaller and have lower horsepower engines. We heard some comments that the vessels that have the larger baselines, that larger vessels are already equipped to fish farther offshore for longer periods of time. They can handle more variety of weather conditions than smaller vessels. So we heard some comments that some fisheries now take place further offshore than they used to maybe 30 years ago when these baselines were first implemented. So this could be for a variety of reasons, like the distribution of the stocks has shifted, or there's other management changes that have been implemented that are restricting where people are allowed to fish. So we heard comments about some fisheries such as monkfish, skates, and groundfish. Those fisheries take place further offshore, at least at certain times of year than they used to. So this means that maybe it used to be safer to target those species closer inshore on a smaller vessel with a lower horsepower engine. But now some people feel like they need to fish further offshore to take advantage of those stocks, and that they feel that it's not as safe to do so on their smaller, lower horsepower engines. So for example, they can't outrun weather as easily with a lower horsepower engine than a higher horsepower engine. A few comments talked about just being aware of multiple lives that have been lost over the years due to fishing in conditions that maybe weren't safe for the boat that that they were using, that people were using. And one advisor also asked for a tally of the number of lives that have been lost over the recent decades. We did hear some other challenges as well associated with these vessel baselines. So they make it challenging to modify or replace vessels and engines. So when people are restricted into only looking for a certain size of vessel or a certain horsepower engine, and you need your boat to have certain specifications for whatever fishery you're participating in, that just kind of limits what's available to you. So it can be challenging and costly to find an appropriate replacement or to make the modifications that you want to make. We heard several comments about modern engines being very different from when the baselines were first established. So not going to pretend I'm an engine expert, but the comments had a lot to say about like a 300 horsepower engine right now, and then especially for some of the smaller horsepower engines nowadays, they might be more designed for like recreation as opposed to commercial fishing. So if a commercial fishing vessel is forced to use a lower horsepower engine, it's going to wear out faster, it's not going to work as well. And then also that people need to make modifications to their engines to force them to work within the baselines. We heard some other comments about there's very limited commercial fishery shipbuilding in the US. So kind of regardless of the vessel baseline restrictions, there's just not a lot of affordable new vessels available right now. So one advisor said, you know, people are fishing right now on very old vessels, but it's just not affordable to buy a new commercial fishing vessel in some cases. So people are forced to replace an old vessel with another old vessel. And so there were some comments along the lines of there should be more efforts to encourage new shipbuilding in the US to help, and other ways to help make it more affordable to purchase a new vessel. We heard a few comments about how sometimes it's necessary to relinquish permits in order to replace a vessel. So this gets back to the concept of if you have multiple different permits that used to be associated with different vessels, that you could have different baselines associated with each permit, and the most restrictive baseline applies in that case. So sometimes folks feel like they have to give up that permit with the more restrictive baseline in order to have the flexibility to purchase a new vessel. And we also heard some concerns about just administrative complications of keeping track of your length and horsepower, some concerns that maybe it's not always documented accurately. Maybe the data that we have available to us isn't totally accurately reflecting the actual length and horsepower of some vessels. And we heard some comments along the lines of folks purchasing a vessel and then later finding out that its length, for example, was not documented accurately, and then needing to go through a process to deal with that. So we did hear some other comments about the benefits of baselines, and sometimes this was some of the same people who talked about challenges. And it's not always the case that people who talked about challenges thought that the baselines just totally go away. There were several comments along the lines of there's some challenges, maybe there can be some changes made, but we do still see value in these baselines that, you know, the council should be aware of. So we did hear some comments about how the baseline restrictions impact permit value, where permits that have larger baselines have a higher value and are worth more money. So there were some comments along the lines of if the baselines were just totally removed, that would devalue some permits and would negatively impact those who have invested heavily. So the permits with larger baselines represent a bigger investment. But on the flip side is that permits with smaller baselines are more affordable, and this can be useful for new entrants because it can help people get into the fisheries, start fishing on a permit with a smaller baseline, ideally over time save up money that you can invest in a permit with a higher baseline. And then also some comments kind of emphasize that the value of a permit is really important for some fishermen's retirement planning. So there was concerns about if we made changes to the baseline restrictions, if that devalues permits, that could be a major impact for things like retirement planning for fishermen. We heard some comments that the baselines do continue to help prevent overcapitalization, at least in some fisheries. So there was some discussion of all the other management measures that are in place that constrain catch and fishing effort, such as quotas or possession limits. So there was discussion that those considerations vary by fishery, and that if we were to remove the baselines, in some fisheries at least, there could be cases where a few large vessels could quickly catch the full quota, and that would be a negative impact. And along the same lines, we heard some comments that the baseline restrictions still play a conservation role in some fisheries. Examples that came up for that were scallop and squid, and it's along the same lines of preventing overcapitalization, that concerns that without the baselines, that catch rates could increase too much in some fisheries, and this could, for example, trigger accountability measures, which could impact everybody in those fisheries. We heard again that there's no one-size-fits-all solution to the challenges for vessel baselines. So, for example, there was comments along the lines of horsepower is less meaningful for fixed gear fisheries compared to mobile gear fisheries. So, for example, one advisor said that he's fishing with gill nets, so if he could have a higher horsepower engine, he could get to and from his fishing grounds faster, but it wouldn't necessarily change how he fishes. As opposed to something like a trawl or a dredge with a higher horsepower engine could tow harder, cover more ground while fishing. So there were several comments just recommending that the councils take into consideration how, for example, gear type is an important way that the vessel baselines have different impacts in different fisheries. And similar to what I said on the prior slide, that there's these other management measures such as quotas and possession limits that constrain catch, so are playing a similar function as what the baselines were intended to do, but that the details vary by fishery. And then comments along the lines of the safety issues are less of a concern for larger vessels, which I previously said that on a different slide, but the larger vessels are already, equipped to operate in different weather conditions, but this is more of a concern for smaller and lower horsepower vessels. So again, we're not at the point of having a management action yet, so we're not looking at a range of management alternatives yet, but we did get some suggestions from advisors and members of the public in terms of if the council were to go down the route of developing an amendment, for example, what sorts of specific changes might they want to see considered. And this list here represents the recommendations of individual advisors and members of the public, and it's not intended to represent consensus recommendations from the advisory panels. But some examples of what we heard were things like potentially removing the horsepower baseline, at least for some fisheries. So again, that concept of it's maybe less meaningful for fixed gear fisheries than for mobile gear fisheries. We heard several comments recommending providing additional flexibility for smaller vessels, such as exempting a certain size class from the baselines or allowing the smallest vessels to increase up to a certain extent. There was a few recommendations to allow permit splitting to help get at that issue of right now when you have multiple permits that have different baselines and the most restrictive baseline applies, that if people were allowed to split up their permits, that could help get at that issue. One advisor recommended when that is the case, allowing the least as opposed to the most restrictive baseline to apply. And there were a few comments recommending exempting hook and line fisheries from the baseline with the rationale of just the gear type used and the way that those fisheries operate, that the baselines, aren't really necessary for constraining catch. And there was an example provided of the groundfish hand gear A permit does currently exempt those hand gear vessels from the baseline. So maybe expanding upon that to exempt other hook and line fisheries from the baselines. And then lastly, for next steps, again, today we're just asking you to provide any guidance on the evaluation. And over the next few months, we're aiming to wrap up the evaluation, finalize the report after digging a little bit further into some of the data, because what Hayden presented is just our initial look at the data. So we want to do more things like looking into how more of this has changed over time, more details by fishery, because again, we know that additional characterizations of vessels with multiple baselines and looking at trends in relinquishing permits to see if we can learn anything from how that might be impacted by the baselines. And again, the goal is to finalize the evaluation in time for the September New England Council meeting and the October Mid-Atlantic Council meeting, so that can feed into your discussion of priorities for next year. And that's all we had, and then we're happy to take questions.
Thank you both for the presentation, and thanks to all the staff for the work that went into this, and also for all the participation from industry that went into this. Some of the intricacies of the issues can only be laid forth by industry for sure. So I'll look around the table first for questions or comments. Mike Pentney, we'll start with you.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for the presentation. I've been following this closely because I'm very interested in seeing where the councils may want to go with the baseline issue. But one thing I noticed when you were describing the existing baselines, you didn't mention the vessel hold capacity baselines that we have for squid and mackerel. I'm wondering if that was an intentional exclusion of those two, or just they're so new that it didn't seem relevant to this potential action.
Yeah, thanks. We are aware of those additional baseline restrictions that apply to the volumetric hold capacity. But just based on the way it was phrased in the 2026 implementation plan and in the response to Executive Order 14276, that language focused just on the length and horsepower restrictions. So that's what we've been focusing on so far. Like you said, those volumetric hold capacities are just in those two fisheries, and they're more new. So just based on like how the council tasked staff with this, we've been focusing just on length and horsepower.
Joe Grist.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for your presentation. Some I'd like to see even more focused into is the economic issues tied to this. I mean, we have trip limits for certain fisheries, what they can land, but I want the vessels to be able to go out there and be able to afford to go out there at today's prices of diesel, at all the other things that they're facing today. I think that's got to be a key element into this. Do we really need these baselines versus the fact we can manage the landings, let them use the vessel? It gives them the most efficiency to go out, get the catch, and get back, which also in turn, if they're really efficient at it, reduces discard. So, I'd like to see focus on that. I think baselines may be useful in some situations, but I think it's hampering the industry, and we are seeing an aging fleet and aging everything in this industry, and find a way to make it more efficient, more cost effective.
Jake, go ahead.
Thank you. I just want to maybe more of an information statement here, because I've been in trawl fishery for 22 years now, and I agree with the aging fleet. And maybe somebody can comment to this. I did learn back when Magnuson's was formed, they gave an incentive to build boats for the ground fishery. Does that sound right? Mm-hmm. So you had opportunity to build boats. Today, it's $4 million to replace a boat, which is a sizable investment to chase around 45-cent fish, to pay $4 million, 7% interest. It's a business issue. So tying that in, because that was part of this, tying it into the horsepower thing. I currently run a boat that has 1,000 horsepower, and I run a boat that has 400 horsepower. The 1,000 horsepower boat catches more fish. It has the opportunity to tow bigger gear. And yes, efficiency is good, but efficiency can also kill the fishery. I'll use scup as a prime example. We got efficient at catching scup, and it closed. Then everybody was upset. So if we all had big boats, big gear, we are going to harvest. You almost need a little bit of inefficiency. So I don't really support that. If we did away with it completely, you're really setting the tone for like factory trawlers. And the people that have the money, which there is people that have the money, will build massive ships, and that's what it will come to. It doesn't seem like it in this how it's laid out, but being in the fishery for as long as I've been in it, that's what will happen. So we do need a little bit of inefficiency, and I do hear like the problem because I face the problem all the time. Like I repowered my boat, and it was a lot of money, and you don't get pound for pound back. You know, I put 7 figures in the boat. That doesn't mean it's worth that much more. You have to operate the vessel to catch the fish to recuperate the investment. So I personally think we have a financial issue in the fishing industry because there is an excess to funds for upgrades and replacements and safety. You have to, borrow money at current market value, which is super high. And inflation has taken such a toll on the fishery where the price for the fish has not kept up with the operation costs. So there is real problems, but I just can't. I felt that I need to bring this up as more of an education thing. I can't get behind completely removing it. I do see the struggles for the small boats. Like that's not really going to increase fisher effort. They can get, but for the bigger boats, there's going to be big cause and effect. Thank you.
Thanks, Jake. Mike?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks, Jake. I think you raised a lot of good points, and I think we've been supportive of looking at this issue for a number of years. I think largely because the permit team at Garfo is responding to a lot of the requests from the industry about upgrades and replacements, and working with a lot of fishermen to try to find ways to kind of relieve their issues. And so we see it almost every day. And I agree. I don't think getting rid of baselines entirely is the way to go, but I think there are some different strategies that the councils could explore that would provide some relief, particularly on the smaller side, as you mentioned, and then some recognition of just how engines have changed and evolved over the last 30, 40 years from when some of these baselines were first established, at least 20, 30 years ago. And one of the things that I think staff mentioned was looking at the number of permits that have been relinquished because they're trying to fit the replacement vessel into their baseline. So they've dropped a permit to get rid of their smaller baseline. We're going to try to pull some data, work with the staff for the final report that shows that. One of the things we're also going to look at is kind of the number of replacements or upgrades that have been denied over the years because the vessel that was proposed exceeded a baseline in some way. That might not be visible in the data that we have presented yet, but it might be important for the council to consider.
Thanks, Mike. I see Bobby Rule.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, I agree wholeheartedly with Jake and what Mr. Petney was saying. There are certain fisheries that this regulation is there to act as a stopgap. I mean, it's a safety mechanism. It's a harvest control for certain fisheries. I actually do have a question as far as when it comes to the evaluation of a vessel that does want to increase either versus the size or horsepower. Who actually does the investigation on it to make sure that they're within parameters, and what information do they look at? I mean, I don't want to get too particular into the engines and mechanics and all that stuff, but there has been a massive change in the last 3 decades in engines. I mean, my vessel, which is old, I'm 49, she's 55, but her engines now that she was built with, we still have original power, are considered low horsepower engines. They're 439 horsepower, but the replacement for that engine is going to, factory replacement now, a tier 3 engine is going to be almost 270 horsepower higher than that engine. But the problem lies in the newer engine doesn't have the torque that the old ones do. So it could not spin the wheels that I'm turning now. So even though the number is higher, the actual power of that engine is lower. And that's a situation that's going to be in a lot of different things. I mean, you can look at charter boats that have 2,000 horsepower, strap them to a tug that's got a 500 horsepower Atlas diesel in it, and put them in gear and see which one's going to win. The number doesn't always reflect fishing power. And I've always wondered, how do we relegate that? Who actually looks at it? I mean, you can take an engine and derate it. You can take the aftercoolers off, you take turbos off, go with a base engine. Who's looking at it? I mean, I know I'm not going to point your fingers, but I know of a case where somebody took an engine that's identical to mine and turned it to a 3508, which is a double the horsepower engine of that on a boat that was half the size. I'm sure you know exactly which one I'm referring to, but where was who okayed that and who looked into it? So I've always wondered, when you go to do this, if it's you just submit numbers and then they do a little bit of math and go, yep, this was intolerant, so you're fine, or nope, you're 2 inches over, or you're a few horsepower off. Now, how do you come to a simple answer? Is, I would say, use common sense. If somebody's got a 35-foot boat and they're looking to upgrade and they're going to go to 36 foot, but it's past their percentage, a foot ain't going to make a big difference. If it's a safety issue or it's a minor change just slightly beyond the percentages, then they're doing the best they can to find a suitable platform. If somebody's trying to go from 30 foot to 90 foot, nah, they're trying to cheat the system. So I'm honestly, I mean, it goes back to the same question. Who is actually in charge of doing the evaluation for the criteria to determine if it's suitable or not?
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, so thanks for that question. The short answer to that question is it's my permit staff, Ted Hawes and his team. We could get Ted to at another meeting to probably talk through the process that they use to review the specs that are provided, in terms of a vessel assessment from a marine surveyor in terms of the vessel length. I'm not 100% sure on what specs they're looking at for horsepower, but we can certainly get that information by the next meeting.
Yes, and if just one second, if I may, then I guess a broader question to that, I guess, would be is how much of that might be able to go into this evaluation, particularly the differences and what it means for either, taking out bulkhead and changing sizes, or the intricacies of horsepower that Bobby's talking about. Is, can some of that be brought into the later parts of our discussions here? Yeah, seeing ahead now. So go ahead, Sonny. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I think I can talk about this subject because we just bought a boat, and we went from a 50-footer to a 43-footer, and a 330 horsepower to a 300 horsepower. We were looking for a 48 to 50-foot boat, but with the horsepower and everything, we couldn't find it, so we had to go down in size. But the only thing that worries me is one of the things happening down in the southeast is recreational and sport fishermen are buying up permits from the king mackerel fishery. Now, if you let this go and let's say, okay, let the smaller boats have it, will this situation happen where somebody can just go get a permit and be able to go recreational fishing and get into the fishery when we have these quotas that commercial fishermen been catching and dependent on? Right now, I know we're working on a high volume fishery, but sooner or later that fishery is going to go down. And will that create a problem with the guys that have been working and catching the fish? And also we're going to open it up to these smaller vessels that are going to go out and catch the quota and create a problem.
Ted?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate Bobby's comments and Jake's comments. They offer a little education to a fixed gear guy. So I'm a lifelong 40-foot range fixed gear guy. And, for us, the horsepower has always been, just government intrusion that doesn't have anything to do with our harvest. I think generally speaking, we're looking at a really complex issue. We're going to have to look at it permit by permit, mobile versus fixed gear, and, fishery types by fishery types. Because like if you look at the monkfish fishery, fixed gear, these regulations are really constraining. That's where you have a lot of guys fishing smaller boats because guys bring in the whole skate now instead of the wing. So they're carrying double the weight. You have like Liam Sullivan was one of the commenters. He's from Little Compton. You know, they've got the same size boat their father had. Their father actually went down on his boat one December, and I was one of the boats racing to him. Another boat from Little Compton got there first. So these concerns are real. And I think it's going to take a lot of careful delineation between fisheries to come to a good resolution to this. And I think, you know, obviously that's where we all want. So I hear Bobby and Jake's points. And I think, well, those are great points. And I hadn't really thought about them. But I know for other fisheries, the economic cost is very real to fish. I won't get into it since we're early in the conversation. I'll just I kind of flipped the question and thought to myself, well, if somebody came to the council and proposed these regulations right now, if we weren't burdened with them and they weren't already here, would I approve them? Would I say, yes, we should constrain the fleet in this way? And the answer is typically no. Why would we want to create these regulations? We're kind of left with them from a bygone era. And part of good governance is constantly pruning the tree of regulation and reducing regulation because it costs industry. And it's oftentimes hard to see that. I just put some numbers together quickly. You know, the EU was formed in 1999, and I'll be brief with this. Their economy was 7.1 trillion. The US economy was 10.2. There were 11 member states. There are now 21 member states in the EU, and in the far less regulated US economy, we've added no new states. Our economy is now $25 trillion and they're at 16. So they've barely doubled the size of their economy, having doubled the number of nations in it. Europe has incredibly regulated economies. That's what defines their business cycles. And so it's hard to see the cost of regulation, but I thought that metric rather clarified it. And when we have regulations that don't serve a purpose, those cost real money to real fishermen right here in our region. And so we have an obligation to make sure that we get rid of the regulations that choke industry without providing a benefit. And I think that's where the nuance and complexity of this issue is going to present itself. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, well said. Thank you. Other hands around the table? Yep, Lori, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A tremendous amount of great points I think we're all talking about around the table right now. I'll just say I think this is a really slippery slope, and I think we have to be very careful, very cautious. Doing it one by one can look not fair to the guy who was told yes and the next guy is told no. I think in the mid, our motto has been to freeze the footprint. That's been one of the objectives, the deep sea coral amendment, the actions that we're taking. That's why we created the whole capacity. I think we have to be really, really careful, and that's all I guess I'll say about it. Slippery slope, and what you do for one, how do you not do for the other? It's going to be a very hard justification to give to one guy and not to the next guy. And I'm not looking forward to this.
Sonny, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, just one last comment. You know, I went home and talked to a lot of my fishermen, and it was like a 50-50, to be honest with you. 50 want it, get rid of it, and 50% want to keep it. And I just wanted to put that on the table.
Yeah, I don't think that would surprise any of us right now. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. Jake, follow-up?
Yeah, thanks. It was real good conversation on this. I do see the constraints for the small boat fishery for sure. Mr. Penny, I had a question when you said you're getting a lot of inquiries for this. So besides the small boat fishery, what would be the main species that these permits are requesting this? Like what's the main driver that's saying they have so much hardship besides like the smaller fleet? Thank you.
Not sure I have an answer immediately, but it's something that we can certainly respond to in the next version of the report. We can look at the number of sort of baseline questions that we get, requests for baseline information that we and requests for upgrades that we get by fishery.
Thanks, Mike. And Sonny?
Yeah, and also could you add to that the CPH permits? Could we break them down to see exactly what species are in them CPH permits?
Yeah, we can do that.
Thank you.
Question from Chris Moore.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I and thanks, Council, for the conversation today. I think there's a number of good points that staff have to follow up on. One of those is what Bobby was talking about, and I'm curious, Julia and Hayden, if the work group has considered what Bobby was talking about. Specifically, has it been an evaluation, or have you started the evaluation of the evaluation? In other words, how these vessel upgrades occur. So I heard, Mike Petney indicate that that's something that they're going to be thinking about. But have you guys have you started talking about that yet? And if not, that might be an important part of what we see in October.
Well, I'll give you guys a quick reprieve because Mike has his hand up, and then if you guys want to respond after that, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, the process is you go on, you go online to our system and you download a vessel upgrade replacement application, and there's instructions on that form for the information that we require in order to process that request, and the documentation that has to be provided in order to validate or verify the upgrade. So we need information, we have all the baseline information associated with your suite of permits. So we need information on the new vessel or the upgrade. And mostly it's marine surveyor information for the length. It could be for the horsepower of the new engine, a marine mechanic on letterhead, their certification, or the original engine specs. So I just didn't have it at my fingertips in the moment, but the process is pretty straightforward in terms of getting that information. Usually it starts with a vessel owner contacting our permit office and asking for their baseline information. What's my baseline? Just want to make sure I've got the right numbers. What are my baselines? What are my upgrade limits? And then they often work with vessel documentation services companies that help them manage that process. They work with the companies that sort of will have vessels for sale, and they'll match. They'll try to find a vessel that fits within a baseline. And so there's a back and forth typically between the vessel owner, the vessel documentation services companies, sometimes the marine surveyors that get involved, and then our permit office ultimately to approve the vessel replacement or the upgrade, and then we reissue the permit.
Follow up, Chris.
Thank you. So I appreciate all that, but it sounded like, again, thinking about what Bobby was talking about, that there's some nuances associated with this process that complicates a decision and the fairness of a particular upgrade, right? So the way that I understood Bobby, based on the fact that you have old engines and new engines, and horsepower could be, different as a result of the different configurations, that may not be accounted for in the evaluation, right? So is it something that needs to be accounted for in the evaluation? Is it something that needs to be included in the evaluation that Mike was just talking about, so that there's fairness and that folks understand exactly what is going on? That's my point. So that's why I posed the question to you guys, which is, have you even talked about that stuff? And I'm curious, have you?
Yeah, to answer that briefly, I think that the working group has been asking questions about, how does the agency track changes in vessel specs over time? Where does that information come from? What is the procedure for making sure that it's up to date? And obviously that information was not included in the briefing materials for today's presentation because we have not done a full accounting of what that process looks like and what the nuances are. So we started thinking about it, but we have by no means done a deep dive into all the details.
follow up, Chris.
Yeah, so I have a very specific question. So looking at your slides, I can't remember which slide it was. I think it was like 7 or 8, but doesn't matter. How many times can a vessel upgrade? How many times can a permit holder upgrade their vessel?
There are no limitations currently on the number of times a vessel can be upgraded.
Yeah, I don't think I ever understood that. So I thought there was a limitation. So yeah, thank you. Capped.
Yes, I mean, yeah, I mean, if you're talking about increasing, you can go from 40 to 41 to 42 to 43 to 40, 44. You can go in half-foot increments. You can do whatever you want, but you're capped at 44 feet. Not 44 feet and 3 inches, 44 feet. And, kind of to Bobby's point, that's, we have a lot of the circumstances where their upper limit is 35 feet 0, and they've got a 36-foot boat that's perfect for their business, and we can't authorize it because it's 1 foot over their limit. And it gives our staff heartburn, it gives everybody heartburn to not be able to approve those, but that's the way the current system is set up. But going from the baseline up to the max, there used to be a one-time upgrade limit, and we got rid of that a number of years ago. So now it's as many as you want. And we do see situations, like Sonny mentioned, where the boat goes down, and then a number of years later they get another boat, it goes back up a little bit and kind of bounces back and forth within their baseline restrictions.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, excuse me. I'm sorry. And that was going to be my next question is the original baseline, even though we went lower, the original baseline stays the same. And then my other comment is I didn't do the paperwork. My Corey Gwynn and my wife did it. And I give a big shout out to your permit crew, Ted Halls and Mary Toppin, because they helped them out tremendously. I had to hear the, oh my gods, so many times that I ain't going to tell you, but thank you very much.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the conversation right now is revolving around the process that happens. But I think, kind of to Chris's point is, in order for us to understand the value of that or the efficacy of that, we need to understand the process. But some of it probably, especially what Bobby was saying about the horsepower is going to be a real challenge to get to on, especially if a lot of this stuff is newer and didn't even exist then, how to compare that is going to be a challenge. So any other hands? Yep, Bobby, do you have a follow-up? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just trying to remember when, because originally the baseline was horsepower and tonnage and length. And I can't remember when we dropped tonnage.
Width, length, width.
No, it was tonnage. I'm pretty sure it was tonnage.
Yeah, in fact, there was two types of tonnage and length and horsepower, and we got rid of the tonnage a number of years ago. I can't remember exactly when, but we did get rid of tonnage. It was almost a meaningless number. And kind of recognize that that's one of the issues with horsepower too. And you kind of summarized it, depending on how you tune the engine, you can get a much different horsepower, out of it. And torque often is what really matters to the vessel you're driving. And so, but the horsepower numbers are there in the specs, and that's what we go by.
Well, I mean, to that point, maybe the language that we use for baselines maybe needs to change. Because if you're going to use your baseline restrictions as a way to control harvest, which is basically what it is, it kind of leans more into what we've done with squids or elex and mackerel, which was the volumetric hold measurement, which was, in my opinion, was done to give an idea of what the actual carrying capacity of the fleet was at any given time. I can see, I mean, all you got to do is look to the north and see what Canada did to get around their regulations. They made boats that were 42 foot long and 42 foot wide. So, I mean, in all seriousness, I mean, you can take a 40-foot class boat, a standard boat that's built here, if it's a bay boat, or if it's a small Novi boat that's nominal width, their carrying capacity is X. But if you're only looking at these two things, you can go up to a 40-foot boat that's, well, actually, Jake knows, how big was the one Brady just bought?
Yeah, it's 50 foot, but it's just like, I think it's 30 feet wide. So it's like a short, fat boat. But to the point, yeah, like, and when we talk about the horsepower and everything, and it's a power package. When you get your power, you are taking into consideration your clutch reduction, the size of the wheel you have, like all that goes into the efficiency of everything. But I know we're talking about horsepower, but you could have, I think there's a boat in New Bedford, the Endurance has a variable speed wheel. So I think it only has 700 horsepower, but you adjust the pitch like the Flicka, that gives you the power. So like, there's a lot to it sometimes, but yeah.
So getting back to the point I was trying to make is I don't think that the horsepower and length, it has the regulatory impact to the fishery as far as an effort control that it may have originally been intended. I mean, there are certain fisheries where regulating horsepower will have an impact, but to me, it's always going to fall back to how much can that boat carry. I mean, if you got a boat that's running with 50,000 pounds and you're going to replace it with a boat that's going to run 300,000 pounds, that's a major upgrade. So, at the end of the day, it's the amount of removals that's happening. And to me, that's more a vital point than trying to lock somebody into a set length or a set horsepower. So, and the reason I'd asked about tonnage is I think initially tonnage was kind of a mechanism trying to get to what the carrying capacity would be. But then people found out that there's ways that you can manipulate tonnage. And so that's how there's always going to be somebody that's going to figure out how to outsmart the system. And if there's a loophole, somebody's going to find it.
All right, I'm going to let Mike Pentney respond, and then I'm going to put a pin in it at the table, and then I'm going to go out to the public for a second. So go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I just we got rid of tonnage in 2015, so 11 years ago. But I just wanted, for this council in particular, provide some context around if thinking back to the slide that showed kind of some of the original baseline actions. Those groundfish and scallops, which were managed, groundfish in particular was managed with days at sea and possession limits. And so, part of this was at the time was constraining fishing power for how much could be caught, on a day at sea. And as everybody knows, the management of our fisheries has evolved a lot in the last 20, 30 years. But this particular system of baselines really hasn't changed in the last 20, 30 years, other than to get rid of tonnage. So, I think there's a lot of opportunity to relook at these issues and make some tweaks, make some more substantial changes, what have you. But, but thinking about, 1994 scallops and groundfish, that was days at sea. And anyway, just supportive of the council having, this type of discussion is a great discussion to have. It gets a lot of the issues on the table, but highlights a lot of the issues that we, are looking at, and hope that we can try to examine and find, find some sort of solution to some of these issues if the councils agree to take this up as an action next year.
Sonny?
Thank you for your patience, Mr. Chair. I have one more question. Do both councils have to agree on whatever the decision is to make this go?
Yeah, these permits are too intertwined, I think, to try to do it council by council. If I think, I don't know if there's a slide, but staff we can certainly help pull the data together to show how many people have permits from both councils, baselines from both councils, the multiple baseline issue. There's a lot of just overlap and complications of one council trying to go in one direction on this and the other council either not taking action or trying to go in a different direction.
Okay. And as I mentioned, I don't want to leave here without giving the public a chance to comment. So are there any comments or questions from the public? Okay. not seeing any hands right now. And just a reminder from staff, we'll see this again in October. That's the target date. And I guess if there's anything in between then and now that the council needs to be aware of, we can do that through email exchange, I guess, and let everyone know what's coming up. Great. Thank you very much. So that was our final agenda item. Chris, do we have any announcements?
We do. We have hospitality this evening. Everyone's invited. It's in room 1029 in this hotel, 1029. We'll see you there.
Great. Thanks, everyone. That's a wrap. Appreciate the discussions. We will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m.